So in the main video, I kind of glossed over one of the most obvious results of A Link to the Past's influence on later entries in the Zelda franchise, to wit, A Link Between Worlds, the 2013 3DS game, which is a spiritual successor to A Link to the Past, as well as one of the most experimental Zelda games to date. I did this not just because the video was getting a little bloated, but also because A Link Between Worlds is such an anomaly among Zelda games that it demands a little extra time and attention to work out how it fits into the series as a whole. Let's start with a refresher on the history of portable Zelda games leading up to A Link Between Worlds. The very first Zelda game of this kind was Link's Awakening in 1993, the fourth entry in the series overall and a very strange one, even though it was mostly produced by Zelda veterans like director Takashi Tezuka and writers Yoshiaki Koizumi and Kensuke Tanabe. All the previous Zelda games had been straightforward sword and sorcery adventures with clear, obvious goals and no ambiguity about who was good and who was bad. Link's Awakening took a more soul-searching approach, placing Link inside a dream world and tasking him with collecting musical instruments to awaken a mysterious windfish. It would be natural for the player to assume that this is a dream Link is having, and that his goal is to wake up, especially considering the introductory cutscene, which shows Link struggling to stay afloat in the open sea during a storm. But the game throws contradictory information at you, with some characters insisting that you're not the one dreaming, you're part of the dream, and if the windfish wakes up, you'll disappear along with all the other characters, good and bad, that you've met on your journey. The fact that this world is a dream is reinforced by the oddness of the things you run across. One of the bosses is a giant face that appears inside a floor. Characters from other game franchises pop up in the liminal spaces between dungeon rooms, and the first NPC you talk to gets turned into a raccoon at one point after eating a magic mushroom. It's all very surreal. Link's Awakening was one of the first Game Boy games to take a serious whack at competing with home console games, despite the limitations of the platform. And it was a big success, I think largely because it was so ambitious. But it might have actually been a little too ambitious, at least in the sense that it made for a hard act to follow. Nintendo didn't make another portable Zelda game for nearly a decade, unless you count a re-release of Link's Awakening for the Game Boy Color in 1998, which frankly, I don't. In fact, you could argue that Nintendo didn't properly make another portable Zelda for even longer than that, because the next bunch of these games were all co-productions with a company called Flagship, a subsidiary of Capcom, which lasted for about a decade from 1997 to 2007. Flagship did most of the actual design for these games, with old Zelda hands like Shigeru Miyamoto acting mostly to advise the team and make high-level judgment calls. Incidentally, Flagship was also the original home of current top Zelda guy Hidemaru Fujibayashi, who cut his teeth making the Oracle games and Minish Cap. So if you notice some tonal similarities between the quirkiness of the mid-2000s portable Zeldas and the occasional silliness of recent mainline entries, that's probably not a coincidence. The games made by Flagship tended to be less intense and psychological than Link's Awakening, and their contemporary home console peers like Majora's Mask, but what they preserved intact was the quirkiness and the interest in experimentation. Oracle of Seasons and Oracle of Ages both heavily revolved around a world-changing mechanic, changing seasons and time travel, respectively, while Minish Cap used changes in the scale of action to create some really fun and amusing level concepts. I have kind of a soft spot for the Minish Cap because I love the premise of little characters using human-sized objects in unexpected ways, like in The Borrowers or Alice in Wonderland. And Pikmin, actually, now that I think of it. Anyway, after these were a pair of Nintendo-designed portable Zeldas, Phantom Hourglass and Spirit Tracks, which actually sold quite well. Phantom Hourglass was the best-selling portable Zelda since Link's Awakening, but it seems like they have a mixed legacy, with a lot of fans feeling that they went a bit too far with gimmicky controls and mechanics, and thus fall short of classic Zelda territory, even more so than the previous games made by Flagship. That brings us up to 2009, and in the 4 years between then and the release of A Link Between Worlds, there were no new portable Zelda games, although 2011 saw the release of the 3DS port of Ocarina of Time, which was massively successful, probably because it had one of the best commercials for any video game ever, starring Robin Williams and his daughter, Zelda. Oh, and also because Ocarina of Time is an all-time classic, yada yada yada. You know what Ocarina of Time is like, and it was mostly designed in 1998, not 2011, so I don't have a lot to say about it here. Let's just move on to the end of the line in 2013. By this time, Hidemaru Fujibayashi had disappeared from the portable Zelda team, having graduated to directing mainline console entries starting with Skyward Sword. The director of both Phantom Hourglass and Spirit Tracks, Daiki Iwamoto, had also mostly transferred to the main Zelda team, leaving the overall approach of this latest portable entry in the hands of producer Eiji Aonuma and a first-time director named Hiromasa Shikata, who had previously worked mostly as a map designer for Zelda games, and also for Pikmin, curiously enough. This is the guy who designed Forsaken Fortress, which you could see as kind of a bad omen, but then again, he also made Windfall Island, so he wasn't totally lacking in taste. And it wouldn't be a big deal even if he was, because this new Zelda game was going to draw heavy inspiration from the established classic A Link to the Past, and also because he had the support of a very accomplished team. Designer Koji Takahashi, who made the characters for Wind Waker, artist Yusuke Nakano, who had been an illustrator for dozens of Nintendo games dating all the way back to Super Metroid, veteran jacks of all trades Tatsuya Hishida and Mari Shirakawa as story writers, and the young hotshot composer Ryo Nagamatsu, whose style you might recognize if you're a fan of Nintendo Land or Super Mario Galaxy 2, or the recent Link's Awakening remake. The weirdest thing about A Link Between Worlds is that, kind of like Metroid Dread, it emerged from the ashes of a project that didn't work the first time it was tried. Shikata had first come up with the idea of having Link merge into walls back in 2009, years before anyone thought to make a reimagining of A Link to the Past. But the idea just went nowhere, with most of the team leaving the project to work on launch titles for the Wii U in the early 2010s. It was only in late 2011, with Skyward Sword wrapped up and the 3DS port of Ocarina of Time selling like crazy, that Eiji Aonuma decided to jumpstart the project again, working with a sub-director named Kentaro Tominaga to create about 50 little mini-dungeons exploring various aspects of the wall-merging mechanic. Sound familiar? They showed all this to Shigeru Miyamoto, who apparently hated it. Good for him. And this was when he suggested that they take A Link to the Past as a reference point for the new project. Aonuma then had the bright idea of rendering the original landforms of the older game into 3D models, which reportedly took forever to do, but it was absolutely worth it. If you've ever played A Link Between Worlds, you've probably noticed that the game's perspective isn't a strict top-down view of the 3D rendered landscape. During development, the team noticed that if they aimed the camera that way, it would hide a lot of visual details from the player, including, just to take a random example, the entirety of Link's model except for the top of his hat. So A Link Between Worlds ended up doing something very outlandish, but also very clever. Everything in the game world, trees, buildings, statues, birds, everything is slanted backwards, so that a top-down view shows about the same level of detail as in the two-dimensional screens of A Link to the Past. This means that if you look at the game from a side-on perspective, Link looks like Piglet trying to walk to Pooh's house on a very blustery day, and everyone's heads are constantly tilted toward the sky, as if jets are passing overhead dispensing free candy. But a little bit of existential weirdness is a small price to pay for visuals that combine the appeal of two-dimensional perspective and three-dimensional detail, and that same synergy can also be found in A Link Between Worlds gameplay. Probably the most famous, or infamous, aspect of A Link Between Worlds is the item rental system, in which puzzle-solving tools are completely removed from dungeons and instead made available for rent at a shop that opens up very early in the game. The dungeons still revolve around using these items, but since you can choose when you get them, that means you can also choose which order you do dungeons in, or switch from one to another if you get stuck by renting a different item. Progression isn't 100% nonlinear, since several items don't become available until you beat the first few dungeons, and at least one is locked behind the completion of a specific dungeon. But the result is still a far more open structure than had been seen in any previous Zelda game, and your choices expand as you move from the first half of the game to the second half. The fact that you're only renting these items can be annoying, since they fly away whenever you lose a life and have to be re-rented. But in my experience, that doesn't happen very often, because A Link Between Worlds isn't a particularly tough game. It's around the same level as the Minish Cap, maybe even a bit easier. It's certainly nowhere close to the level of challenge seen in A Link to the Past, which features a lot of devious traps and enemy encounters designed to eat up your hearts like deviled eggs at a wedding reception. I've heard two major criticisms of the item rental system, one which I entirely agree with, and another which I mostly disagree with. The one I agree with is that being able to see all the items you're going to use up front is immersion-breaking, and sucks a lot of the magic out of using them. It used to feel like you were in a dungeon that was made by the same people who made the special item, and acquiring it was part of untangling the dungeon's mysteries. Here it feels like you're buying a membership to a club and you have to swipe your card at the door to get in. It's just a bit too obvious that each dungeon was designed to make use of an item, rather than the item reflecting a pre-existing dungeon theme. The other, related criticism is that the dungeon design itself suffers from this nonlinearity, since it deprives A Link Between Worlds of a satisfying difficulty curve, deep puzzles, and an overall sense of progression from one level to another. And if the dungeons in A Link Between Worlds were solely based on puzzles involving their signature item, I would agree with this criticism. But they aren't. And in fact, I'd argue that this game has pretty superb dungeon design on the whole, regardless of the potential problems caused by nonlinearity. The first dungeon in the game, the Eastern Palace, isn't item-based at all, and instead devotes itself to exploring the wall merge mechanic, which is put to excellent use here as well as in the overworld and most other dungeons. The House of Gales and Tower of Hera are a little duller than this, and both suffer from being quite short. But to be fair, this is also a problem with the introductory dungeons in A Link to the Past. On repeat playthroughs, I wouldn't call any of these 6 dungeons a highlight of the series, but they have to get the player accustomed to the basics of dungeon exploration on an initial playthrough, and they do a pretty good job of that. The dungeons in the game's second half, on the other hand, are among the most unique and interesting in any 2D Zelda game. The Skull Woods and the Thieves' Hideout are the only ones I'm not a huge fan of. But then again, they also don't actually require any items to complete, so that second point really doesn't apply here. You could criticize the Thieves' Hideout in particular for being an escort mission or for being too gimmicky, but it is an exciting change of pace and features a great boss fight. And the other low-rule dungeons go above and beyond to stand out with more than just basic use-item-on-obstacle puzzles. The Swamp Palace is beautiful and surreal, reminding me a lot more of Ocarina of Time's Water Temple and the Temple of Droplets from Minish Cap than it does of the original Swamp Palace, with water-level changing mechanics that demand a bit of advanced planning without becoming too frustrating. And the Dark Palace, although I'm not a fan of the forced stealth section right before it, really charmed me with its aesthetics and the idea of using darkness itself to guide you, which is a puzzle that requires you to stop using a key item. That's actually really clever, and something you don't often see in Zelda. The Desert Palace, Ice Palace, and Turtle Rock are all personal favorites of mine, not because I love the items used in them. Actually, I find all 4 of the rod items in A Link Between Worlds pretty boring, but because of their layouts and the unique way each one forces you to get around. Turtle Rock is a particularly good example of a dungeon that benefits from having an unusual shape. It's one of the most compact level designs I've ever seen, but getting around is still challenging, and yes, fun. For the most part, these are dungeons that are both fun to play through and fun to just be in. The way you get the items is somewhat immersion-breaking, sure, but the dungeons themselves are very immersion-forming. I wouldn't rate them quite as high on average as the ones from A Link to the Past, but that's a high bar to clear, and I'm not sure any other 2D Zelda game would clear it. The closest for me would probably be the Minish Cap, and I love that game. I'm not knocking A Link Between Worlds when I say that I consider them to be on roughly the same level, albeit for different reasons. The Minish Cap, for instance, had really strong enemy variety in its dungeons, while A Link Between Worlds is weaker in this respect, with only a few real standout enemies. The puzzles are definitely more engaging than the combat, and the bosses are generally pretty weak, in both senses of the word. I also think the overworld content between dungeons is somewhat below par for portable Zelda games, with a lot of the directly comparable elements lifted from A Link to the Past being a little worse here than they were originally. It's a minor difference, though, and a lot of these elements, like the giant bomb that you have to babysit as you make your way to things in need of blowing up, are still pretty fun and nostalgic. Finally, we have the story, and this may be a bit of a controversial take here, but I actually quite like the story of A Link Between Worlds, especially the idea of Low Rule with its second inverted Triforce. I don't want to spoil too much of it, because this is a game that I wish more people would play, and I think they deserve to have a fresh experience with it. But I will just say in passing that there's some truly compelling characters who take part in it, and I'm not talking about either Link or Zelda. Or the sages, to be honest. I'm not a big fan of this group of sages, especially since you may not have even spoken to some of them by the time they need to be rescued, so they come across as a bit flat, personality-wise. Still, the game doesn't really insist that you pay much attention to them, except for Gully, but seriously, I'll make an exception for Gully. How can you stay mad at this face? All in all, A Link Between Worlds is just about the best kind of sequel I can imagine from a franchise that's known for having a direct sequel problem. It doesn't outdo the game it's based on, but I never expected it to do that, even if such a thing were possible. What it does is to take the basic idea of A Link to the Past and interpret it through the lens of a very different central mechanic, to make something that's far more suggestive of A Link to the Past than directly comparable to it, while maintaining the classic Zelda approach of emphasizing dungeons over the world map and puzzles over combat. But I have to say, it's very disappointing to me that for their next project, the Portable Zelda team fell back on old, and in my opinion bad, habits of making the sequel to a successful Portable Zelda goofier, gimmickier, and multiplayer-er. Triforce Heroes is not a game calculated to appeal to fans whose interest in the series was rekindled by A Link Between Worlds. I'm not sure exactly who this game was made for, but I do know that there's not many of them in the Zelda fandom, and even fewer who also have 2 like-minded friends to play with. This was around the same time that Chibi Robo Ziplash and Metroid Prime Federation Force came out, so Nintendo's portable division was clearly ailing at this time, probably not helped by the fact that Satoru Iwata passed away during this same period. And unfortunately, that lukewarm note was the one that Portable Zelda went out on. With the phasing out of separate portable and home consoles in 2018, Nintendo officially put an end to their practice of making 2 different styles of Zelda, and also strayed very far afield from the traditional style for home console entries. For the past 7 years, there have been no new old-fashioned Zelda games. Instead, that itch has to be scratched with remakes of earlier games like Link's Awakening, and however experimental these remakes might be aesthetically, there's no chance of them experimenting with the franchise's mechanics in the same way that A Link Between Worlds did. Also, I think it has to be said that Nintendo is not really making anything other than Breath of the Wild likes these days. Even the remade classics are not being designed by Nintendo, but by Grezzo under Nintendo's direction. And if you think there's no real difference between the two, I have one word for you. Eyeballs. Grezzo also made Triforce Heroes, by the way, and this is just one more indication of Nintendo's current lack of interest in leading the development of any project that isn't a blockbuster like Super Mario Wonder or Tears of the Kingdom. Everything else gets outsourced to a greater or lesser extent. Just like how Game Freak turned the development of its Pokémon remakes over to a company that used to make CGI cutscenes for JRPGs and an app that made Hatsune Miku dance on your Domino's pizza box. If alternate universes are real, I'm sure there's one, probably a better one than this, in which Eiji Aonuma and the rest of the Zelda team decided to capitalize on A Link Between Worlds' success by giving it a proper sequel, featuring another totally new mechanic like the wall merging to tie a fresh assortment of clever dungeon designs together with. In that other world, where dandelions taste like cookie dough and gumdrops fall from the sky instead of hail, A Link Between Worlds became the progenitor of an entire new subtype of Zelda game, one which held on to the importance of dungeons and puzzles while shaking up everything else in new and exciting ways, so that by now, in the year 2024, there have been 3 or 4 of them released to critical acclaim and tens of millions of copies sold. In that alternate universe, maybe Breath of the Wild came out in 2017, and maybe it didn't. Maybe it wasn't needed, since with the increased experimentation in portable Zelda games, people stopped feeling that the franchise had become stale. Maybe Zelda became the tentpole franchise of the 3DS, giving it the shot in the arm it needed to convince Nintendo to make another portable console, which survives to this very day. Maybe instead of me complaining about modern Zelda games, this universe has a YouTuber named Biniman Swar, whose avatar is a CG animated teapot, and who spends all day complaining about the fact that Nintendo makes so many Pikmin sequels that he doesn't have time to play them all. But then again, who knows? The thing about this alternate history speculation is that you can never tell how one change would lead to another. Maybe in this other universe, the Confederacy won the Civil War, and Koji Igarashi became a celebrity chef instead of making Castlevania games. Maybe A Link Between Worlds was always destined to stand alone as the sole classic Zelda experience of the 2010s, and I'm expecting too much when I say that Nintendo should have had more faith in its approach and stuck with it. If there's one thing that I've learned from playing A Link Between Worlds, it's that no matter how bad things are, they could always get worse, especially if you spend too much time dwelling on the mistakes of the past. What's done is done, and the people we blame for the way things are probably weren't as selfish or irresponsible as we think they were. And as long as we keep the memory of our glorious past alive, it can always come back someday, whether through our own actions or the goodwill of a kind stranger whose circumstances aren't so different from our own. It's like Ravio always says, there's 3 keys to living a good life. 1, be a nice guy. 2, if you get too scared, run away. And 3, make that paper. And on that note, let's get back to the main video.